It is on a stormy day that Indiana Jones finds himself on a flight off the coast of England. He also finds himself alone on this plane. The plane is also in a nosedive, heading straight for the water below. Blankets are the closest thing to a parachute on board. Not ideal, but they'll have to do. Welcome to the Indiana Jones Lorecast, where we delve into the lore and the history of the Indiana Jones franchise. Hello everyone, and welcome to the show. Today we will be covering the next two issues of the Further Adventures of Indiana Jones comics by Marvel. These are issues 3 and 4, and issue 3 picks up right where 22 Karat Doom, the second issue, left off. So, without any delay, let's jump right in. The first page of the comic gives us the title for our story, The Devil's Cradle, and shows Indiana Jones holding onto his hat while parachuting down from the clouds. This is, of course, directly running off of the end of the Icons of Incompetence story, where he has to bail out of a plane into the stormy weather outside. If you are curious about that story and haven't heard of it before, I have done a whole episode on the Icons of Incompetence storyline, so you feel free to go check that out if you're interested. So as Indy is parachuting down from the clouds, there is quite a storm going on. There is thunder and lightning, the whole thing. Very, very dark sky. And as he gets closer to the ground, he hears something cutting through the thunder, and that is gunfire. Someone shooting at someone else, and he thinks to himself how he should have stayed on the plane. Never a dull moment in this man's life, it seems. Indy eventually touches ground in this wooded area somewhere in the mountains, and he hears and sees this whole party of men running around and shouting things like, "We done got him cornered," and things like that. And the way that the lines that these men are saying are written very much gives an idea of the accent that they're speaking with. And I'm not sure if this was the intention or not, but all of these men, in my mind, end up sounding like Larry the Cable Guy. He sees that this group of men have cornered and caught this young blonde man, this very well-built young man, and are preparing to hang him here in the woods. And Indy remarks that he seems to have dropped into the middle of an old-fashioned lynch mob, and he's sort of watching from behind these rocks, and as he sits there in the rain, he thinks to himself that this might be interesting to watch, and he could probably get a paper for the Folklore Society and make the victim famous. Of course, that will do the victim no good, as he would still be dead if Indy doesn't intervene, but he thinks that he'd be a fool if he interfered, because it's not his business and not his fight, and he is obviously very much outnumbered and outgunned. He thinks to himself, I'm an archaeologist, not the cavalry. I'm not in the last-minute rescue business. And in the very next panel, we are shown him pulling out his whip, as he says, but it's something I've got to do. So, he had us in the beginning there, just thinking he was going to sit by and let this happen, but apparently not. So, the process of this lynching is suddenly interrupted, as with a crack, Indy's whip appears from the bushes and snags the barrel of one of the men's rifles. Indy then steps forward through the rain into the open, and tells them all to keep their hands in sight, to stand back, and if any of them so much as twitches an eyebrow, it'll be raining on their brains. That's certainly a threat. I can't say I've ever heard that one before. He of course has his revolver out, and he's holding them all at gunpoint, asking the young man if they should go. The young man says yes, that he'll lead. Indy says that that's a good idea, because he doesn't even know what state he's in, or much less where to run. And as the two of them begin to weave through the trees, Indy says, "Nuts, I forgot." And the young man asks, "What?" And he says, "To collect their guns." And as he's saying this, gunshots are just cracking off all over the place behind them as they're forced to duck and dive through the bushes and are now running for their lives. So, that's pretty funny. Indy and the young man weave their way out of the trees eventually to a road, and they see that there is an army truck that has been tipped over onto its side. Indy is of course surprised to see this, and the young man says that we had to turn it over. The soldiers don't want grandfather to make his elixir. And when Indy asks what he means, he says that it is an elixir of mortality. So that's quite a bit of info to just drop like that. But so Indy is of course a bit skeptical of this. You know, saying, what, so your grandfather is making an elixir of mortality? And he goes, yes, that's what I told you. And they begin to try and find a new hiding place. And as they are doing this, they hear a voice say, there they are, boys, the saboteurs. And turning around, they see this colonel standing there with his hands on his hips looking at them. This is an older man with a moustache, kind of reminds me of like a Sam Elliott type character. So, with his hands on his hips, this man says, bring him to me dead or alive, and you'll get a medal, or my name ain't Bulldog Hannigan. Colonel Bulldog Hannigan, that is. So, I thought to myself when I first read that, wow, he really made clear for us, the audience, his name and rank, so calling attention to it like that probably means he's a real guy. So, I did some research and I couldn't find a single thing on a Colonel Bulldog Hannigan, so I guess that's not the case. I suppose this is just a character who likes to state exactly who he is to complete strangers. So yeah, that's a bit strange. So at this point, the US Army starts shooting at the two of them as they continue to run through the woods. So the young man says they're angry because of the truck, and Indy says to him, now the army. You aren't awfully popular, are you? And so yeah, just to sort of recap this very weird scenario, he's met this young man, saved him from a lynch mob. The lynch mob is not the same people as the US Army. These are just two separate groups of people. This bunch of locals from wherever they are, and the army are both just trying to shoot them dead at this point as they're just running through the trees. And they make it to a bridge eventually, a rope bridge. Doesn't look very safe at all. And Indy seems to think this as well, as he says, this is the bridge, I'd rather face the rifles. But the young man presses on, and Indy follows. As the two men cross the bridge, they hear voices shouting from behind them. It is the lynch mob from earlier, and Indy, taking his whip out again, turns around and says the local welcome wagons found us again. And he hardly has time to do anything here because the men arrive at the end of the bridge and say that there's no sense in wasting a bullet. We'll just cut loose the bridge and let the mountain kill them. So that's exactly what they do. They cut the ropes loose and the bridge then begins to plummet into this ravine that they are above. But as I'm sure you'd expect, as the bridge is falling, they of course grab onto it. So as the one end of the bridge is cut, it swings and crashes into the cliff on the other side. And while the two men hang desperately from it, the group stands on the opposite side of the ravine firing at them, with the rocks all around Indy and the young man exploding as they are struck by the bullets. They manage to climb out the other side of the ravine and continue running away, with Indy explaining that he would actually like to meet this man's grandfather. You know, just out of curiosity. He says, call it professional curiosity, professional scientific curiosity. And says that of course he doesn't believe in something like an immortality like elixir, but he said that a few months ago he didn't believe in the power of an ancient Jewish relic either, and yet he saw it destroy an entire Nazi regiment. And this, again, is in reference to Raiders of the Lost Ark. And we will be getting to that story, though I'm sure most of you have seen it already, because it is the first ever Indy film. We will still be covering that, just like all the other stories, but yes, another fun little callback to that. As they continue their journey through the woods, still through the pouring rain, with the thunder and lightning crashing above their heads, they eventually come to see what is known as the Devil's Cradle, which is this mountain with this strange kind of rock formation on the top. It looks as if a stone cradle is sitting atop the mountain, hence the name. So several hours later, they reach the base of this mountain, and they see that there is this cave. Of course, the young man knows this already, because that's where him and his grandfather have been working, making this elixir of theirs. Upon entering the cave, Indy is surprised to see this whole kind of campsite going on in there. They clearly have been there a while or plan to be there a while. The grandfather is reprimanding the young man for bringing a stranger into their cave. After calling his grandson things like a dullard, he sort of goes, well, what's done is done. You might as well just come warm yourself by the fire, like get out of the rain. And he says that his name is Prospero. And Indiana Jones then introduces himself. And the old man and him kind of just have this conversation about the elixir. With the old man explaining that in this cave is a special kind of water that is not found everywhere on Earth. So he has to travel from place to place making this elixir out of this water before moving on to the next location. And he says that obviously whoever drinks it is given long life, and that he has the special skills needed to make this stuff. This particular set of water, bunch of water, whatever you want to call it, within this mountain, within the Devil's Cradle, is currently being endangered by the US military, who has a camp nearby. And Prospero and his grandson caught wind of them having plans to blow up the Devil's Cradle because there was a concern that the cradle might roll down the mountain at some point and cause a landslide. That would bury them in their camp should it happen. So the army had plans to blow the whole mountain essentially to ensure that that doesn't happen. But doing this would bury Prospero's cave and their new wellspring of water. So they of course were not willing to let this happen. So we are told at this point that the truck flipping was them. It was done by them in order obviously to kind of halt their plans. And from that truck, Prospero had taken a whole lot of explosives, these big red barrels, and they say that their plan is now to blow up the Devil's Cradle themselves, but in such a way that it will cause the very landslide that the army fears, and will actually bury the US Army's camp, buying them enough time to make all the elixir that they need and then move on. And Indy, hearing this part of their plan, kind of, realizes what's happening here and goes, well, dozens of innocent soldiers will be buried, and I'm afraid I can't permit that. The old man says that yours is not a permission to give, and begins speaking another language briefly. And when Indy sort of goes, beg your pardon, he says, sometimes I forget which country I'm in, sometimes which century. And he says that he is not going to allow Indy to leave the cave. This is clearly an open confrontation at this point, with Indy turning around and saying, I don't like to rough up somebody older than myself, but you don't give me any choice. It is then that Indy and this man, Prospero, begin to fight. And though Indy gets a few good shots in, good punches in the face and whatnot, they don't seem to do much, as the old man seemingly, with great ease, is able to just knock him onto his backside. And he then reveals that he had drank the elixir recently, a few hours ago, a few hours before this fight. And the young man remarks that it makes anybody stronger than a herd of bulls. And at this point, Indy uses his whip in the fight, and says, now there's a coincidence. He's strong as bulls, and guess what kind of whip this is? Obviously, very cool, that is a bullwhip. Ultimately, it doesn't help Indy very much, as the old man simply is able to grab it and backhand him, and continues to throw him around this cave for a little while. And there's a point where Indy's face is kind of splashed into this this container or tub of this special water, this elixir. It is about the size and shape of a bathtub, I suppose you could say, though it's made out of, an ancient stone structure. Indy is then knocked unconscious during this fight, and when he comes to, he finds that it is now nighttime, and he, Prospero, and Prospero's grandson are atop the mountain. They have tied Indy to the Devil's Cradle on his back. They have also packed some of the barrels of explosives under the cradle in order to enact their plan and at the same time get rid of Indy. And Prospero has a bit of a strange philosophy when it comes to this, as when Indy asks, why go through all this for me? Why don't you just kill me in the cave? He says that he doesn't want to kill him because he's not into that kind of thing. Yet he's fine with doing this because if Indy is killed in this situation, it'll be by the rocks or the avalanche, but will not be by his hand, so he will not be responsible for his death. So I'm not too sure that tracks, but anyway. Indy has a look at the ropes with which he's bound, and sort of thinks to himself that there's no way you can break these. As Prospero and his grandson light this very slow fuse and begin their descent down the mountain to get clear of the blast, Indy finds that, surprisingly, he is able to snap the ropes. He thinks to himself that this might be because of his face briefly being shoved into the water, the special water, thinking it's clearly given me this brief amount of superhuman strength. And he then goes to pick up some of these explosive barrels to hurl them off, and finds that no, maybe it hasn't, because they're still breaking his back to try and pick up. So he's going to have to do this the old-fashioned way, with just regular muscle. And he also finds, during this whole frantic scramble of his to remove these explosives, that the ropes had actually been purposefully cut, obviously by Prospero's grandson, who this whole time has seemed very reluctant to go along with his grandfather's insane plans, and especially to kill Indy, since Indy did just save his life this very same day. Indy begins to chuck the barrels of TNT off the mountain, and he chooses to do this rather than just snuff out the fuse, because he wants Prospero to think, at least for a short while, that his plan has worked. And so he does this. He throws several of the barrels off of the mountain, and as they explode down below him and just ring out all across this valley, he just sort of sits there on the rock and falls asleep. He just is waiting for the army. That's the other reason why he wanted to still have some explosions go off, is to sort of signal to the army to go there. And this part of the plan certainly works, as Indy wakes up with several barrels stuck up his nose, basically, as the army has arrived. And guess who's with them? Standing there with his hands on his hips is Hannigan again. And he says, and I quote, "Hannigan's the name. Bulldog Hannigan. Colonel Bulldog Hannigan." Again, he just feels the need to constantly declare in detail who exactly he is. And, end quote, by the way. He didn't say what I just said, he just said the first thing, but I'm sure you know that. He tells Indy that he is under arrest, and they obviously think that he's responsible for all the sabotage that they've been experiencing. So he is knocked out, and the colonel tells his men to collect all the dynamite that he was hiding away and just to shoot him. We then get this very brief scene of Prospero and his grandson moving some more of the TNT barrels on the mountain. And they basically just have this discussion with Prospero telling his grandson that he's soft-hearted, and that's not really a good thing when it comes to people like Indiana Jones, because he's this trickster. But with Prospero reminding him that Indy saved his life, Prospero actually has some sympathy for this, saying that, it's probably just his tender age that causes him to be so forgiving towards people, and at his age he might have made the same decision. And so you actually get some empathy from the guy there. So, very interesting and short interaction, as we then move on to the army camp, where Indy has woken up in the holding cell. And the colonel tells him that he was going to put him in front of a firing squad, but was reminded that they are not officially at war, so they can't treat dirty traitors like you, as he says, the way that they should be treated. So at the end of this very confrontational back and forth between the jail bars, the colonel leaves the room, asking Indy what his traitorous name is right before he does so, and Indy says that his name is Smith, John Smith. And as the colonel's walking out the door, he says, well, that sounds familiar, I've probably seen it on one of them wanted posters. And he just closes the door. So Indy thinks to himself that this is not going to go very well. He's not going to bother trying to explain that this immortal old man is responsible for everything that they're experiencing, because he's not sure he believes it either. So he takes his belt off and uses it to sort of snag the keys across the room. In sort of he doesn't have his whip, so he has to make do. But upon using the keys, he exits the jail cell, gets his gun and his whip, his satchel, the whole thing, and sneaks out of the building that they were holding him in. He runs across the base grounds for a short while before seeing the colonel's jeep sitting there, ready to be driven, and hooked up to the back of this jeep is this piece of artillery, this big cannon on wheels. Indy hops into the jeep and takes off racing in it. Obviously, the soldiers are all shouting after him and shooting at him. The windscreen gets shattered pretty much instantly as the bullets whiz by, and Indy thinks to himself, quote, "Here I am again, doing what I seem to do best, making it up as I go along," end quote. And he then races off towards the Devil's Cradle once again. He crashes through the perimeter fence of the camp and heads off towards the mountain, driving right past that lynch mob from earlier, and they of course see who's driving the jeep and are all freaking out, going, "Hey, you go this way, we'll go that." They're trying to coordinate some way of catching him as he flies right past them in the jeep. Reaching the base of the mountain, he uses a pair of binoculars to see that Prospero and his grandson have loaded a whole new bunch of TNT under the cradle and are running down the mountain, obviously, to get clear of the blast. They're just doing the plan over again. Obviously, they've realized that the first time didn't work. So Indy then gets behind this piece of artillery and says that he saw one of these things demonstrated once, but he wished he'd paid more attention when he saw it. He's thinking to himself, I think the shell goes in here, and this is how you aim, and this shoots it. And it does indeed shoot it, as the thing just lets out this thunderous bang as it sends a shell hurtling towards the mountain, and he pretty much hits it right on target, as it hits all of the TNT barrels and blows pretty much this whole face of the top of the mountain. And of course you might be thinking, well, didn't this just do the same thing that the TNT would have? But apparently not, as he shot it in such a way that all of the debris is now sliding down the far side of the mountain. Because of where this detonation came from, he was able to blow it all off the other way, thankfully. Indy travels then to the cave, where Prospero and his grandson were making the elixir, to find that it has been buried under the tons of rock that have come from the top of the mountain. There is no sign of Prospero or his grandson, but it's at this point that a gun is trained on Indy, and it is these two men from the lynch mob. They have found him. And they say now they finally caught him, and they're going to just shoot him. They're not even going to bother talking. Then Indy takes the binoculars and holds them out for the men to take, saying, "You might as well have these, I won't be using them." And one of the men actually holds his hand out to take them, saying, "Well, thank you," and just gets hit immediately in the face with them. So Indy just knocks him out with the pair of binoculars. And the second man points his gun at Indy and says how he's not going to get him like that he's dead. But at this point, the second man is attacked by Prospero, of all people. Prospero and his grandson have returned, and Prospero grabs this man's rifle and just wrenches it right out of his hands and shouts off after him as the man runs away, that he'd just be gone, calling him a lowly son of a something, as he's again speaking in another language. And Indy is of course confused, saying, you saved me, why? And Prospero says, and I quote, "The cave's buried, the spring's gone, the damage is done, we've no cause for further quarrel, We should be friends. Come, my grandson awaits. He hath a pathway off these wretched peaks. Make haste." End quote. And as the three men sort of just continue to traverse these mountains, Indy asks them, "Well, you didn't have enough time to prepare your elixir. Will you be able to find a new source of the water in time?" And Prospero again says, quote, "Indiana, I have lived for over 4 centuries, and have kept this young dolt alive for 2. Somehow I think we will survive." End quote. And that is the final panel of the Devil's Cradle story. So before we move on to issue 4, we are just going to hop over to the mid-break, so I will see you there.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Why, hello there, and welcome to the mid-break. This is just a short segment in the middle of the episode for me to discuss a few things that you might want to know about, things about the show itself, things like that. Firstly, I'm your host, Kel, or Sir Bandit, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are enjoying the episode, you can let me know by leaving a review or a rating wherever you're listening, as it really helps the show's growth. Also, on Apple Podcasts, if you head over there and leave a 5-star review along with an actual typed review with it, I will be reading out that review on a future episode, in the mid-break, like you're listening to now. There are none to read for this week, but if that's something you'd be interested in, if you'd like to get a message onto the show, tell me what you're enjoying about it, how it has fundamentally changed your life, things like that, then feel free to do that. And other than that, you can contact me by following any of the links that you will find in the episode description. You can come hang out in the Discord, we'd love to see you there, and that is pretty much all that needs to be said for this mid-break. So let us continue with our story.
I'm going after that truck. Oh. I don't know. I'm making this up as I go.
So we now continue with episode 4, or issue 4, I should say. This one is titled Gateway to Infinity, and the opening page of this issue shows us a plane travelling, once again, over a stormy sea. It is approaching the cliffs of Dover in England. And as I'm sure you've guessed, Indiana Jones is on this plane. It is only him and the pilot, and he's been sent to England by the government to investigate something. And the pilot and him are discussing what they need to do, as they might need to ditch the plane because of the bad weather. And the pilot says that they'd have better luck trying to just bash the gear around and get it to work. So Indy goes to do this. He then calls the pilot by his name, just saying something like, "Oh, I'll get it, Smitty." And the pilot says that his name is not Smitty, it is Schmidt. And he slams the door shut behind Indy, locking him in the cargo hold. And Indy goes back to the door, like jostling the lock, saying, "Just open up, Smitty, turbulence must have jammed the door shut." And he then realizes, wait a minute, this isn't jammed, this is locked. And now the plane is going into a nosedive. What's going on? And looking out the window, he sees Smitty, or Schmidt, has jumped out the plane with a parachute. So, looks like someone found out that he was heading for England, as he says. Someone who wants to make sure that he didn't get there alive. So, in this nosediving plane, Indy is rummaging through the bags and boxes and getting all of his gear on, and he shoots the lock on the door so that he's able to exit the plane, and he also uses a blanket from these Red Cross shipments, as he says they're meant to help people in need, and right now I'm the people in need. So he leaps out of this plane with just a blanket. He's just holding this large green blanket above his head as he does this, and as if this is not precarious enough, he then finds that the blanket has been cut right down the middle. So they've clearly thought of everything, as even this makeshift parachute of his has been foiled. So, plummeting way too fast towards the cold, grey and stormy ocean beneath him, he ends up just ditching the blanket, and he throws his arms and legs out as wide as he can to increase his wind resistance, and then at the last second goes into a dive. And doing this, he goes straight into the water, huge splash, and we see that his hat is just floating in the ocean, and there is silence, which is broken by a hand. And that's a pretty cool moment. We have the sequence of 3 panels showing what happens as Indy comes up out of the water with his head going perfectly into the hat. So he basically just rises up, breaks the water, and he's already wearing his hat, if that makes sense. So he looks ahead to see that a Royal Navy patrol boat is heading his way, as they must have seen the plane crash. And he was waving his hat to them in the water, asking them if they can give him a ride. And they do. And so, a few hours later, Indy is dry and talking to some men around a table at a private government building in central London. The men are apologizing for the whole ordeal he went through, and they did not know that the enemy knew about the Gateway Project. And Indy, of course, asks what the Gateway Project is. They explain that it's the reason that they asked the US government to convince Indy to help. So they ask that if he has ever heard of Stonehenge, and of course he has. And they explain that a few days before his arrival, a freak electrical storm hit the area and toppled one of the stone blocks at Stonehenge, and split it open to reveal a very unusual artifact hidden in the center. It is the small crystal cylinder. The surface is carved in symbols of a language that is totally unknown, never been seen before. And of course they think that this message on the cylinder is of vital importance, and unfortunately agents of Nazi Germany have also discovered its existence and are obviously going after it themselves by any means necessary. Indy then remarks that Uncle Sam didn't mention that he'd be putting his life on the line when he was called on to this job. And he says that while he doesn't mind dangerous work, of course, he just wished they'd be more upfront about it. He's then introduced to his project co-worker, their lead expert on ancient languages, a Dr. Karen Mays, who is this woman with short red hair. And she offers to take Indy out to this French restaurant that is nearby, as he looks hungry, and he is hungry. So we then cut to this French restaurant. It's quite a fancy place, and the two of them sit at a table. And they going back and forth with, admiring each other's work, and Indy is being flirtatious, as he often is, asking, he wants to know more about her, and she says that her life is quite boring, and they should talk about him instead, and it's just this back and forth, but it is interrupted by Karen noticing something wrong, and asking what's the matter, and Indy says, "I'm not sure. I do seem to have a little problem here. There's a fly in my soup." And she says, "Well, oh dear, I suppose that can happen even in the best of places. But what's more alarming than the fact that there's a fly in his soup is the fact that the fly is burnt to a crisp. It seems to be sizzling and being burnt to charcoal in the soup." And we then see behind these curtains one of the waiters or kitchen staff is standing cursing the British sanitation standards, as this never would have happened in Berlin, as this fly being in the soup has obviously clued Indy up to what's going on here. It is acid that he has been served, so someone has tried to poison him here at the restaurant. And so they get up and leave, and the guy at the front asks, what's the matter? Was there something wrong with the food? And Indy says, "No, not if you don't eat it." So yes, clearly Nazi agents had infiltrated the restaurant and were posing as the staff trying to poison Indy. Now, they knew that they would be at this restaurant because when he met Karen Mays at the British government building, 4 blocks away in a darkened basement, there's a group of Nazi agents with spying equipment listening in on the conversation, as obviously they've hidden microphones in the room. And this man in this trench coat is obviously the one leading this whole operation. And when he's told that the microphones are working well, he says that that's good, because the Führer still bristles at the memory of the Lost Ark affair, another reference to Raiders, and he says, and particularly at Indiana Jones's participation in it. And so that's interesting that Indiana Jones has the personal attention of Hitler, and we see that the pilot from earlier, Smitty, or Schmidt, is sitting in the corner of the room shivering and cold. He's sneezing, obviously, because he had to also bail into the ocean in his assassination attempt on Indy. And as he sits there in the corner, it says on the panel, "The American-born Nazi pilot shudders, not totally from the cold and damp." So he is, of course, quite afraid of this man in the trench coat. But anyway, so after the whole fly ordeal at the restaurant, Indy and Karen buy some food from a fish and chip stand on the sidewalk. They discuss the strange cylinder of crystal that was found at Stonehenge, and Karen tells Indy that it was dated to be from the Triassic period, and that is long before humans ever walked the earth. So she asks, "Do you know what that means?" And he says, "Yeah, it means we'd better get started on that translation." And so, over the next few days, that's exactly what they do. Over the next few days, the two of them combine their brain power to make educated guesses, take measurements, and eventually, through many sleepless nights, they come to a few conclusions as the clues start to reveal themselves. We see the sleepless nights evident on Indy's face as his stubble has grown out a little bit. And they are both very excited by what they found. And according to the translation, as they say, those carved symbols were carved by creatures that predate man on Earth, and they fled to some other realm, promising to return when needed or when safe or something along those lines. Why they left in the first place is not clear, but according to their translations, they will return when the stars are in a very specific alignment. And they discuss, what it means, that this is a whole new culture, a whole new, race to explore. This is archaeological history. And Karen says that she'll ring the Major right away, but Indy tells her to hold off on that because what they know right now is potential power. This information is power, and the fewer people know about it, then the less chance it has of falling into the hands of spies. And we see that this conversation is indeed being listened to by spies in the same darkened basement, with the man in the trench coat saying that the strike team must be given notice to move in. They want this artifact for themselves, of course, now knowing what Indy and Karen have found out. The guy in the trench coat says that if the forces that this releases are good, then they will be obligated to us for freeing them. And if they are evil, then they can, reduce this island nation to cinders. Either way, the Reich wins. So 45 minutes later, in the room where Indy and Karen have been working, we find out that Karen has been on the phone to the Royal Observatory, and they say that the stars will be in the correct position at exactly midnight that night. So, awfully convenient. And she's packed the cylinder away into her bag, and she says that this is super exciting because these beings could be the factual basis for our oldest legends. They could be the forerunners of unicorns, of angels. And Indy says, yeah, or devils. And as they're saying this, some soot is falling down in the fireplace, down the chimney, and when a sneeze is heard, they both say, "Bless you," and they sort of, snap their heads, look at each other, and they say, "I didn't sneeze, neither did I." Then who? And then we see this Nazi strike team crawling out of the fireplace, and the guy in front says, "Forgive me, it was a natural reaction to breathing soot." And we see that he thinks to himself, damn British sanitation standards. Again, so clearly these Nazi agents are being repeatedly foiled by British sanitation standards in the 30s. And yes, this takes place right after the first two issues, so the year in the story is 1936. Anyway, moving on. These men that have crawled out of the fireplace all have machine guns. There are 3 of them. And they, of course, ask them to hand over the cylinder, and they might let the woman live. And so Indy says, just give me the cylinder. And, she's of course objecting, and she says, no, I think he's right. I think we'd better give it to him. And as he says this, he draws his revolver and shoots one of them. And he kicks the table up into the other two, and the two of them, Karen and Indy, jump out the window. And she's, shouting, we're on the 4th floor. And he says, trust me. And as they go out the window, they land on that sort of awning above the front door down by the lobby. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, those kind of cloth things. Must still be an uncomfortable landing, but anyway, they're alive. They run down the street and climb into this taxi in a huge hurry, I'm sure you can imagine. And the taxi driver is quite flustered by this. But Indy says, look, pal, this lady's working for your government, and we're carrying something extremely valuable. And those Nazis are trying to... And he doesn't even get to finish the sentence, as the driver then takes off at this very high speed down the road. He says, Nazis, why didn't you say so? I'll take you to the bleeding North Pole if you want. And Indy says, thanks, but we'd just like to get to the train station in one piece, if it's no trouble, as this guy is mounting the pavements and smashing through things. Obviously very dedicated to trying to get them to safety, which is cool. The driver says that he knows of a little shortcut, and when they reach this shortcut, they find out that just about all of London knows about the same shortcut too, as it is bumper-to-bumper traffic. So Karen and Indy see the men chasing them on foot, and decide that they're going to just try hoofing it. They get out the car and run, and the taxi driver shouts after them that there's no charge, of course, and good luck. And Indy says, thanks, we'll need it, as he runs off. So the taxi driver sees the men chasing after them and opens his door and causes the first man to just smack his face into the door and fall down as the others try and pick him up. So he buys them a few more seconds. And thankfully the Nazis don't hurt him because of this. As the two of them run through the crowds, Indy is shouting things like, out of the way, please move it, excuse me, life or death. And one of the men in the crowd remarks, must be an American. They reach one of the entrances to the underground, the subway. They run down the stairs with Karen asking if he thinks that they saw them go down here, but it doesn't matter because they're not stupid and they're gonna think to look here soon enough. And as he says, we'll be sitting ducks waiting for the Kensington local. So at that point he decides that the two of them are gonna have to hide down the tunnel. So they climb off of the platform and begin walking down the tracks, trying not to touch the electrified rail, of course. After a short while of sprinting down the train tracks, the two of them stop to catch their breath, with Karen saying that she never knew language studies could be so strenuous. And Indy says that unless those goons are better than he thinks, then they've got nothing to worry about, and as he says that, gunshots ring out as the bullets hit the wall right beside them, and he moves himself to cover Karen. And he turns around and says, they're better than I thought, because there they are, running towards them. And Indy says, come on, we can outrun them. And Karen's looking ahead of them, and she says, Indy, can we outrun that? And as I'm sure you can imagine, the train's coming, because of course the train's coming. So the headlights are sort of blinding everybody as the Nazi agents run to hide in the maintenance tunnel. And as the train passes them all, they exit the maintenance tunnel again to see if they were squashed by the train or if they went to hide in the other maintenance tunnel. Either way, they'll just shoot them like fish in a barrel, so it doesn't matter. But they see that they are not there in the maintenance tunnel, nor are they in pieces on the tracks. So where'd they go? And his question is answered by one of the ventilation covers hanging open above their heads. So they very narrowly were able to crawl into these vents right as the train was coming. So that must have been quite the feat. So we see that Indy and Karen have made their way back to the surface, with them running around on the streets above. Indy says that he once worked on a dig where a subway construction crew had uncovered an Indian burial ground. And so, of course, while working on that dig, he learnt a lot about the Senecas, that tribe of Indians, and he learnt a lot about subways too. and we've bought ourselves some time, but we still need a way out of London. And so he looks across the street and says, well, it might as well be one with style, as there's this very luxurious car sitting outside of what I'm guessing is a hotel. And the driver is letting out this couple who are dressed quite fancily, as they are thanking him and saying that the driver can return for them after the play. And so Indy and Karen rush into the door of the car as the couple exits the back seat, with the driver obviously asking, like, what do you think you're doing? Indy says that he's an inspector and he's been assigned to check all the Rolls-Royce sedans for possible steering defects. The driver is objecting to this quite a bit, as I'm sure you can imagine, but as Indy races off down the road in the car, he shouts out the window that there's no cost to the owner, naturally. And the couple say, like, oh, calm down, they say to the driver. The man says that the service is free, so no need to panic. So Indy now has this very luxurious getaway car. As they race down this bridge, Indy says that he hopes that those folks will be compensated for any wear and tear on the car, but at least it saved their lives. And Karen says, for the moment, Indy, but you seem to have forgotten that in England we drive on the left side of the road. And he is indeed driving down this bridge on the wrong side of the road. And he shouts, oh my gosh, I gotta swerve out of the way. And in doing so, he smashes into this other car and then smashes into the railing of the bridge, like tearing chunks out of the stone, and eventually breaks right through the barrier on the bridge. But luckily, the back bumper of the car catches on the bridge, preventing them from just hurtling down into the water. Indy smashes his face into the windscreen because of this crash, and Karen says that she's scared. And he tells her, don't worry, Karen, the Jones family luck hasn't given out yet. I may not win any good driver awards, but as long as that bumper holds, all we have to do is sit and wait for... And he, of course, sees that the bumper is cracking and shifting and is very much not going to hold. The information on the panels tells us that it only takes about 6 seconds for the tottering limo's weight to turn a spit-polished automobile into the world's most luxurious coffin, as the final panel shows us the car lurching towards the water, with Karen screaming in the passenger seat. And that is the end of issue 4, Gateway to Infinity. Normally when it comes to which stories I cover, I try and mix it up a bit, as I've said before. I'll do a TV series story one day, then the next week it'll be something from the comics, but in this case, the very next episode of the Lorecast will be continuing on with the comic series, just for the sake of not leaving this cliffhanger, literally, or bridge hanger I should say, for too long. So you won't have to wait too long for that. The very next episode we will be going over episodes or issues 5 and 6 of the Further Adventures of Indiana Jones. I'm going to hold off on discussing my thoughts for this whole England story, as it has not yet come to a close, so that'll be left off till the next episode. But the whole thing with the elixir of immortality was a very interesting story. Definitely the whole climax with the artillery shooting at the mountain, that was pretty cool, and the mad dash between lynch mobs and army. It was it was classic Indiana Jones, just running for your life through the woods. That's pretty much what most of it comes down to at the end of the day. Yeah, very fun, very, very fun stories. And that is going to be all for this episode then. So thank you all so much for listening to the end, and if you have any questions, you can find me in my office. But until then, remember, if you find yourself fighting a very old person, don't hold back. Don't pull your punches. I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Indiana Jones Lorecast. If you like what you hear and want to support the show, then drop a rating or review wherever you're listening. I'll see you next time.
Do you love Dragon Age? Have you always wanted to learn more about its vast world and detailed lore? Are you still attached to your hero of Ferelden, even a decade after Dragon Age Origins came out? Or maybe you're a newer fan, still discovering a new tidbit or quest every day.
Well, either way, the Dragon Age Lorecast is the podcast for you. I'm Austin, also known as Teacup.
And I'm Shelby, also known as Shecup.
And come and join us as we embark on a journey to explore and discover all things Dragon Age.
We'll discuss all kinds of topics, from Lyrium to the Chantry and the great mysteries of the old gods, and even more that even you BioWare superfans might not know about.
So come and listen on Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. And always remember,
swooping